Hello there, my name is Marina White, and in this video I will be making a presentation on games, narrative, and argumentation through the lens of Sonic the Hedgehog 3 and Knuckles. In this video, I will be covering the context of the game, my central argument, a phenomenon unique to the game I will be discussing later, and how player difficulty and the narrative are intertwined. Let's begin with context. Sonic 3 was released in 1994 for the Sega Genesis. Its case was unique in that since the game was so ambitious and the game industry loves to time crunch, the game was released in two parts. In this part, you can play as Sonic and Tails in the first 6 zones: Angel Island, Hydra City, Marble Gardens, Carnival Night, Ice Cap, and Launch Base. Sonic and Knuckles was released a couple months later as the second part of the game. You can play as Sonic and Knuckles in the other 6 zones: Mushroom Hill, Flying Battery, Sandopolis, Lava Reef, Hidden Palace, and Sky Sanctuary, with the additions of Death Egg and Doomsday if you choose to play as Sonic. The two parts become the whole that is Sonic 3 and Knuckles using Sega's lock-on technology. When both games are combined physically, the game is combined narratively, allowing you to play as all 3 characters in all 14 zones. When asking how this design choice made by Sega affected the game, we are brought to my central argument regarding narrative articulation. Through the structural and mechanical design choices like that in Sonic the Hedgehog 3 and Knuckles, players are granted agency over how they experience the game's narrative. Sonic 3 and Knuckles in particular does this subtly through the lock-on technology feature and character selection. Narrative is defined in this context as the underlying story or exigence that allows the player to immerse themselves within the game. Narrative also controls the means by which events are presented. Story and plot are subsets of narrative, but narrative is essentially the glue that holds together the components of character, plot, mechanics, and story, which all result in the player experience. In Sonic 3, our characters are Sonic, Tails, Knuckles, Dr. Robotnik, and the Chaos and Super Emeralds. The plot involves Sonic and Tails trying to stop Dr. Robotnik from launching the Death Egg, while Knuckles, their rival, is making their lives difficult by creating obstacles in their way. Going through the zones, Sonic learns more about the island and obtains the Chaos Emeralds. Dr. Robotnik is defeated by our heroes in Launch Base, leaving the Death Egg to crash into the island. The problem with this narrative is that it has loose ends. Knuckles is still out to get Sonic and is still helping Dr. Robotnik with his objective. The player never learns why Knuckles is siding with Robotnik and trying to stop the heroes from saving the day. Sonic and Tails are still stranded on Angel Island. It's almost as if the plot was abruptly stopped in the middle. In Sonic and Knuckles, our characters are everyone in Sonic 3 minus Tails. The plot continues from the end of Sonic 3's with Dr. Robotnik trying to relaunch the Death Egg and Knuckles still being a problem. When reaching the Hidden Palace, Knuckles is betrayed and decides to help Sonic take down Dr. Robotnik. He succeeds, bringing the peace back to the island. Knuckles' gameplay is an epilogue of Sonic's, and he goes through the same zone Sonic did, trying to take out Dr. Robotnik's remaining badniks. Knuckles' narrative makes sense, but Sonic's doesn't. It's missing context. Additionally, even if you were to collect all 7 Chaos Emeralds and defeat Dr. Robotnik in Doomsday, the player is still unable to achieve the good ending to the game. This is the game's way of making it apparent to the player that its narrative is merely a piece of a whole. And here's why. Sonic the Hedgehog 3 and Knuckles are meant to be played as one game, one narrative. Sega designed this not only structurally with the lock-on feature of the cartridges, but narratively as well. Both games can be played without the other, which leaves the player with 2 narratives to play through, though they feel incomplete. But when both games are combined into one, the narrative halves become a full complete narrative and a full game experience. The narrative of Sonic 3 and Knuckles is 1 game, 2 chapters, and 3 experiences. Here in this chart you can see examples of the narrative experiences in each game. The main differences are in character selection, the relevance of the Chaos Emeralds, the zones you can play, the narratives themselves, and the physical cartridge difference. Sonic 3 and Sonic and Knuckles have separate narrative experiences, but only Sonic 3 and Knuckles has the complete narrative with the Chaos and Super Emeralds. The game also is the only of the 3 to have both the complete main and epilogue narratives. To complete the narrative puzzle, you have to physically piece the cartridges together into one. How cool is that? The gameplay of Sonic 3 and Sonic and Knuckles supports the idea that they are 2 narrative chapters of the one whole. On the left, you can see the beginning and ending of Sonic 3, and in the ending of Sonic 3, you can see Dr. Robotnik crashing into the island. On the right side, the image of Sonic and Mushroom Hill takes place directly after the end of Sonic 3, and the ending defeating Dr. Robotnik in Doomsday is the more fulfilling end of the 2 games. That being said, when you put all the beginnings and endings of both Sonic 3 and Sonic and Knuckles together, you get the one game, the one narrative that is Sonic 3 and Knuckles. Although not made apparent, the character selection determines the difficulty of the game, and that player difficulty has an effect on the narrative. Let's focus first on how each character affects the narrative experience. Sonic is the narrative's hero. When you play as him, you are acting as the hero of the narrative. As the hero, he can harness the power of both the Chaos and Super Emeralds. With this ability, he is able to save Angel Island by battling Dr. Robotnik in Doomsday, which is unique to only Sonic's narrative. When playing as Tails, you take on the narrative role of the sidekick. Tails follows a similar narrative to Sonic, however Tails cannot be the hero since Sonic already is, and the game reflects this in that Tails doesn't have a hyperform, nor can he engage in the final battle against Robotnik and Doomsday the way Sonic can. Knuckles in Sonic and Tails' narrative is the rival. Aside from the duel in the Hidden Palace, the player does not directly interact with him, but rather they do through cutscenes. These cutscenes play a crucial role in the narrative since they are the most important pieces of the hero and sidekick narratives, hence why these cutscenes with Knuckles cannot be skipped. Without Knuckles' cutscenes, the player cannot advance to the final zones of the game. When you play as Knuckles, you play as the protector in a narrative that is the epilogue of the hero and sidekick narratives. When playing as Knuckles, you fight Egg Robo instead of Dr. Robotnik, indicating that he has already been defeated. The absence of the Death Egg is the biggest pointer in that the player is following an epilogue narrative, as it is missing from the backgrounds of Launch Base and Lava Reef, and Knuckles' narrative ends at Sky Sanctuary. In this context, a cutscene is a cinematic experience in the game that occurs without the interaction of the player, usually used to advance the narrative of the game. The photos below depict Knuckles' cutscenes in the hero narrative. In the last one on the right, he is betrayed and decides to help Sonic and Tails, which is necessary to advance the final zones. Dr. Robotnik and his badniks are the villains of the game, disrupting the peace of Angel Island to achieve world domination through technology. The player interacts with the villains through defeating the small enemies in the zones and fighting more powerful ones in the boss battles. No matter which narrative storyline you choose, Dr. Robotnik and his badniks will always be the villain. The Chaos Emeralds themselves are crucial narrative characters. These mysterious gems hold the power of the world's balance. Anyone worthy of the emeralds can harness their power to use as they see fit. Without the Chaos Emeralds, the balance between peace and chaos cannot exist, and without their existence, Sonic cannot be the hero and Dr. Robotnik cannot be the villain. Hence, the narrative of Sonic 3 and Knuckles could not exist. The characters of the Super Emeralds are even more mysterious than the Chaos Emeralds, having an unknown connection to the island and the Master Emerald Knuckles is sworn to protect. In order to awaken the power of the Super Emeralds, one must wield the Chaos Emeralds and give up their power for a chance to prove themselves worthy of harnessing the power of the Super Emeralds. Sonic's ability to use the Super Emeralds is what allows him to take on Dr. Robotnik in the final battle in Doomsday. Without the power of the Super Emeralds, Dr. Robotnik cannot be truly defeated, and the player cannot have the good ending. Let's now discuss how character selection is related to difficulty, and how that difficulty affects the player's experience of the narrative. Playing as Sonic allows the player to experience the narrative at normal difficulty level. He doesn't possess any abilities that allow him to skip through the important chunks of the zones, experiencing the full narrative sequence that the zones have to offer. If the player wants to achieve the true narrative ending, they must play as the hero, meaning playing as Sonic so that he can face Dr. Robotnik in Doomsday. Playing as Tails allows the player to experience the narrative on easy mode, using his flying ability to skip the more difficult sections of the zones. However, playing as Tails limits the player's narrative experience since they don't have to take in the narrative that is shown in the background of the zones. Additionally, Tails cannot be the hero according to the narrative constraints, which is reflected in how he's mechanically restrained from harnessing the power of the Chaos Emeralds and not having a hyperform. Playing as Knuckles allows players to experience the narrative on hard mode, giving the player a lower jump height than Sonic and Tails and making him unable to use the offensive abilities of the elemental shields. Sonic 3's narrative experience as Knuckles also differs greatly from that of Sonic and Tails, since Knuckles' narrative is the epilogue of Sonic and Tails' narrative. The game reflects this through the subtle changes in the backgrounds of the zones, Knuckles' punch, glide, and climb mechanics, and the removal of the Death Egg and Doomsday from the narrative. In this context, game mechanics are the role-based systems within the game that reveal to the player what they can do within the game from a technical standpoint as well as a dramatic standpoint in order to best engage the player with the game. Each of the 3 playable characters have mechanics that are unique to them. Players are afforded the ability to use those mechanics to fit their desired experience of Sonic 3 and Knuckles' narrative. Sonic's let the player be the hero. Tails' allows them to easily reach places of high elevation or to skip parts of the zones entirely. Knuckles' allow the player to access parts of the zones you couldn't as Sonic and Tails, as if it were a reward of new game content after beating the main game as Sonic or Tails. This quote pulled from narrative says, "Once game space became a world, it was not difficult to imagine this world as the setting of story, the characters as intelligent, autonomous agents engaged in the pursuit of their personal interests, and players' actions as the events that help the characters reach their goals." This quote here suggests that players feel an incentive to fulfill the game's narrative. But is that really true? Sonic 3 and Knuckles can be won without fulfilling the narrative. To defy the narrative in this case would be to ignore the Chaos and Super Emeralds. No matter which character you play as, fulfilling or defying the narrative will result in receiving the good or bad ending. Although obtaining the emeralds are necessary to achieve the good ending, they are not necessary to complete the narrative. Therefore, the player does not have to fulfill the narrative win. They may also defy it. This fits well with how Sonic 3 and Knuckles already provides a variety of narrative experiences for the player through character selection, since now the player has even more narrative agency. Conclusion. What was meant to be a solution to a design problem resulted in the genius construction of a complex narrative experience for the third sequel in the Sonic the Hedgehog series. Both halves offer two compelling narrative options, but one is simply incomplete without the other. When both games become one through a physical action, the resulting reaction is that the games become one, giving the player the most fulfilling narrative experience. The narrative experience of Sonic 3 and Knuckles is bound by the character that the player chooses to play the game as. Although not explicitly stated, the player's choice of character defines the difficulty of the experience, player's role in the narrative, and the timeline of events that take place and their relevance. Lastly, players are afforded a variety of means by which they can experience the game's narrative, but they have the choice to fulfill the narrative's true ending or to defy it. No matter what choice they make, Sonic 3 and Knuckles is designed to allow the player to make that narrative choice and continue on with the sequences of events. This concludes the presentation. Thank you for watching.